Another characteristic of life is energy use. A light example of that is a kitten uses energy from its mother's milk to fuel its growth. Plants use light energy to fuel their growth, and this is all part of a metabolism. Another characteristic of life is the maintenance of internal constancy. We call that homeostasis. Within our body, we have kidneys, which help us regulate our body's water balance, and that helps maintain a consistent internal state in our bodies. Here's an example from a paper about heat dissipation in hummingbirds. You can imagine a hummingbird is using a ton of energy flying around and hovering. Well, while it's running its metabolism at such a high rate, it creates a lot of extra heat. In order to maintain a consistent internal temperature, it has to somehow get rid of all that extra heat that it produces. And this paper really illustrates how it does that in a very clever way. You see that we're looking at a hummingbird in flight using an infrared camera that's looking at the heat dissipation on the body of the hummingbird. And you can see a lot of that heat is dissipated through the orbital area around the eye, also in this axial area, kind of like the armpit of the bird, and also on its feet. So next time you see a hummingbird hovering, you can pretty much assume that it's got a lot of heat leaving the eye area, the armpit area, and its little hummingbird feet. Another characteristic of life is its ability to reproduce, grow, and develop. Here you can see a bean going from a seed, sending a root down using energy from those cotyledons, those tissue storages within the seed. It's using that to fuel the growth and fuel these new root tips that grow out laterally. Once those root tips have entered the soil, they can gather nutrients and gather water and further fuel the growth of the seedling. Now this organism is transitioning into a new stage. It's left the soil, and now its first leaves are emerging, and you can see that those leaves are now able to access light and gain some energy from light. And it's also at the same time taking in CO2 and using that gas, turning that into carbohydrates and turning that into cellulose, and using that to build new growth, new shoot structures, and it's growing into a new life stage. And so this whole process is an example of growth and development. And you can see that during the time we've looked at the seedling, this sped up footage, it's gone from just a single seed to two developed organ systems. You can see the root system developed, and you can also see a shoot system now developing. Another characteristic of life is its ability to evolve. An example of that is bacteria and its ability to quickly evolve resistant to antibiotic drugs in a lot of different environments. Because bacteria reproduce so quickly, you can actually visualize this with a clever experimental setup and watch evolution and watch the flow of evolution over a well set up petri dish. And what you have is a huge plate of agar, and it's set up in a lot of different bands, and we have basically 10 different bands. On the edges we have agar that has no antibiotic, but then we have a band inside that has 1 unit of antibiotic. Then we have 10 times more antibiotic, 100 times, and finally at the center of the plate we have 1,000 times higher concentration of antibiotic. So it should be more and more difficult for this bacteria to grow across this plate. Now remember, we're starting from the edges, the right and left side. You can see that these bacteria quickly colonize the antibacterial free area. But then at some point, one of those individuals is a mutant, and it has the ability to resist the antibiotic. You can see there's a lot of different individuals that start to make little populations of mutants, and it continues to grow towards the center. So what you're seeing here is the flow and the selection of individual bacteria that have a resistance to this antibacterial drug. And finally, we see that in the center plate, we have the selection of mutants that are able to resist this 1,000 times potency antibiotic. Now here we've placed dots on where these mutations occur, and we can actually see the flow of mutation and evolution through this bacterial population. So these are the characteristics of life that I'm asking you to remember and study. But of course, there's more, and different scientists have different definitions of what life is and what life isn't. What's really interesting is to look into the debate as to whether or not things like viruses are alive. Viruses don't have the ability to generate their own energy. They usually have to steal that ability from their host. And so viruses are an example of something that has genetic material that does evolve, but maybe isn't alive or is alive.